Hey, welcome to another Fundamental Friday. My name is Tyler Bourne. I work with Tyler Edlin, and today I've got a really fun exercise about playing with proportions. Okay, so here we have an exercise where you can play around with using different proportions. I think it's a really good exercise for just forcing yourself to come up with new ideas. It starts off really easily. I think it's got a low sort of barrier of entry because you're just sort of laying in rectangles and then just playing with both the widths and the heights of each of the rectangles. So today I'm going to be doing sort of like these robot character kind of things. So in this case, the red rectangles are representing my head, the purple is going to be my torsos, and then the blue is the legs. And I'm just stretching and pulling those rectangles to come up with different sizes and proportions. And then we'll sketch over these proportions. It's similar to that exercise where people will draw blobby shapes and then sketch in like a face or something like that, where they're utilizing the abstract shape to come up with a design. Same sort of idea. And of course I'm using characters here, so they each get one sort of body part, but you could utilize the same idea for a different subject matter. For example, you could do something like a castle where maybe you're breaking it down into the roof shapes, the cylindrical towers, and then more of like the cubic type shapes, like the walls and rectangular towers. So you would start laying it in something like this. And of course, if you're designing different castles, in this case, you're going to have multiples of each color because you've got multiple towers and roof segments, that kind of thing. But the exercise remains the same. It's basically pushing and pulling these shapes to come up with different proportions to hopefully, jog your mind into coming up with some new ideas. All right, so let's jump into it. So now that I've got my proportions sort of figured out, let's go in and start some sketching. In today's demo, I'm going to be working with just silhouette. So I'm going in with just a hard full opacity brush and just painting in and erasing out of these shapes, hopefully trying to find some interesting shapes. But you don't necessarily need to do this exercise using silhouette. You can also just sketch in with line over these cubes here. I was just wanting to practice some silhouette sketches, so that's what I chose to do. So this one here is interesting, kind of like wide head, but then narrow body. So that's always kind of interesting / tricky. And you can see that I'm not adhering directly to the rectangles. You can break the shapes out a little bit, especially if you're trying to like have a smaller shape meet a larger shape. There can be a bit of like blending between the shapes happening. As you can see here, there's a sort of a taper happening at the top of the torso to kind of come together and meet the head a little bit. So the rectangles are really just meant to be a guide for you. You don't have to follow them verbatim, but do be aware that the more that you break away from those rectangular proportions, you might start sort of breaking your proportions a little bit. You can see here that the torso doesn't take up that whole purple rectangle, but I do try to take up most of it because if I don't, then it's changing the overall proportions quite a lot. So I am trying to more or less stick to what I've got here. Stick to the game plan as much as possible. But again, you don't necessarily want your designs to just be cubes either, right? You want to sort of break away from the cubes a little bit, or the rectangles, I should say. And since I am working in silhouette, these are robotic forms. So I'm sort of just implying some mechanical bits by having some hopefully interesting negative and positive shapes happening. Yeah, this is a fun exercise. Again, I think you can do it with pretty much anything, and it's really just pushing and pulling, and it almost becomes abstract because you're just sort of thinking of ways to fit shapes into these other shapes, and it's a little bit like a puzzle, and you just sort of have fun with it. just playing around with placement a little bit here and there. This guy is very top heavy, but that is what was dictated by my proportions, so that's what I'm doing. On to number 3 here. So this one effectively becomes sort of a big triangle because each segment of the body sort of gets wider and wider as we go from top down. So it's a little bit like a Christmas tree. So just trying to figure that out. And I should say too, as I'm sketching these out, I'm also trying to make them not exactly symmetrical. I'm trying to think a little bit about stance of these characters and hopefully giving them, I mean, these aren't the most interesting poses by any means, but, you know, trying to give posing a little bit of thought as well. You know, so you can definitely use the symmetry tool and that'll actually speed up the process too, but it might be a little bit boring. So I'm trying to introduce a little bit of asymmetry here as well. Now this guy here, I end up scrapping this one for a different design, but I left this part in because I actually prefer this design. At the time I didn't like it, and so I killed it and then replaced it with something else, but I caught in editing, I think I actually prefer this one better, and the reason I do is because that it's got a really wide like torso shape, and in the later one that section sort of gets taken up just by his arms, or its arms. And I think this one with the wider actual like torso, it both leans more into the proportions that I had laid out, but it also is just a bolder statement in general. So here, going back to number 3, just because I wasn't super happy with that one either. And you'll see in a moment that the tall 4th one I go back to, I redo that one. But I actually prefer that first one I did now looking at it. Unfortunately, I only caught that during editing of this video. So it is what it is, but maybe I'll go back and swap that one out. So even though you have these proportions laid out, there's still just so many possibilities to fill it in. You can do pretty much anything. You're just, again, it's just playing with smaller shapes within these larger proportion areas. But there's so much exploration to do. You can do pretty much anything. So you see now that 4th one is in there. I didn't have that section recorded, but looking at it now, I think it's actually less successful because the torso is a different proportion, and it's sort of just, it's got its hands sort of on its hips, and that's what's taking up that wider purple section. But I think having that as an actual wider torso was a stronger design decision. So shame on me for not kind of sticking to the shapes, I guess. And this one here is fairly humanoid proportions, I think. So just trying to come up with something kind of interesting. Again, trying to imply some stance. I'm thinking this robot is looking off to the side or something like that. It's not directly facing us. Again, you can have some facing us, some could be completely symmetrical, but I think that introducing a little bit of asymmetry makes it a little bit more interesting, especially if you have sort of a character lineup like this. You might want, you know, some facing us, some sort of facing the side, more of like a 3/4. Think about how they're carrying their weight if they're characters. You know, maybe they're leaning most of their weight on one leg or something like that. Makes it just slightly more interesting. Not that any of these poses in this video are particularly great poses, but another tall one. This one I explored a few different ideas. For a little bit, I wanted it to be sort of like this giant worm thing, like maybe a character, like a robot controlling a giant like tentacle or something like that. And then somewhere around here, I start to notice that there's like legs here maybe. So started to fill that in. but it sort of broke my proportions. To me, this looks like a very long, tall torso, which was not what my proportion squares were dictating. So I ended up scrapping this, but there's something weird with the stance here that I kind of like. It's kind of quirky, but in the end, I felt like it was sort of off the brief, so to speak, in terms of what my proportions were laid out with the rectangles. So I ended up scrapping that. But from there, I did have the idea of, maybe there's a smaller character at the top riding something tall. So for a little bit, this was going to be maybe, some sort of hovercraft or something like that. But again, I was like, does that, if the blue shape is supposed to be my legs and I don't give this thing legs, is that cheating? And so in terms of, the presentation, the demo, I figured I'd give it legs, but depending on what you're doing this for, if you're doing it for a brief that dictates that, then that's fine. But if you're doing it for yourself, feel free to break away from these, rules. If you want to do one without, traditional legs or something like that, then go for it. Feel free to explore different ideas. The point of the proportional squares is really just to give you a starting point, just to get your mind going a little bit, coming up with some ideas. It also gives you like a little bit of limitation, but if through that process you come up with an idea that you think is interesting, then by all means explore that idea. And then finally we get a little stumpy character here. A little short, squat character. And you'll see with this one I struggle a lot. I always find it really interesting when characters maybe like a little bit top heavy and they have short little legs, but it is sometimes difficult to resolve because legs are usually one of the taller sections of characters. So just trying to figure out a way to make that work in hopefully an interesting way. Took me a little push and pull to get it going. But in the end, it ended up being, I think, my favorite character. I should also say that the trap that I typically fall into with this silhouette design is because it's so solid and it's so direct, I sort of fall into the trap of thinking that it's quick and easy or should be quick. But that's not necessarily true. I end up sort of scribbling a lot and then having to search for the design, almost like I'm becoming too reliant on happy accidents happening, and you can't necessarily gamble on happy accidents. So I think in the end, it behooves you to slow down and be a little bit more deliberate. Even though it seems like it should be fast, definitely slow down and think about the shapes that you're creating, that kind of thing. I think you'll actually get a better result faster if you slow down and make more deliberate decisions. Here I break off script a little bit, and I had the idea of putting the head sort of mid-torso. So I am starting to sort of break away from my rectangular proportion marks there. Like the red square would be sort of embedded in the purple square. And again, I think that's okay. That was just a starting point, and now I'm coming up with something that I think is a stronger idea. So it's all part of the process to get to a result in the end. So you can break away from the original plan. And again, struggling a little bit to find, how those stumpy little legs fit into the proportions in a way that hopefully makes a bit of sense and looks halfway decent. And there we go. So now I'm going to add just a bit of grayscale shading to these guys. It's not going to be super fleshed out or anything. These are going to stay pretty loose. But the way that I do these is I duplicate my silhouette layer and I turn it gray. And then I give that layer a mask, a layer mask. And I'm just painting into the mask black and white. So where I'm painting with black, it's showing through to the original black silhouette layer underneath. And where I'm painting white into the mask is where the new gray shade is. And so within that, any shade of gray within the mask ends up somewhere in between. So you can end up with sort of like a gradient of values here. And again, not being too precious with this, I think with this particular exercise, I'm mostly letting the silhouettes do the work. I'm sort of treating this like a very early exploration stage where, these things aren't fully fleshed out or anything. It's just a general idea, first impression sort of thing. And a lot of the times the silhouette will give you that first impression. So this like quote unquote value that it's getting isn't, it's there to just imply a couple of ideas, but I'm not really like locking anything down super well or anything. So there you can see the gray layer again with the mask, and I'm just, the first thing I do is sort of really softly with a hard round brush that has some pressure sensitivity. I just sort of knock back the bottom half of it to give it a little bit of a gradient top to bottom. So there will be more contrast at the top of the characters than the bottom. And then just sketching out, trying to find, the inner forms. I don't always render like this, but I sort of do like the idea of painting into a mask, because the gray is there and you can just push and pull, I think, a little bit more easily than if I was, painting with actual paint on a pixel. It sort of feels like a little bit less of a commitment to me to have it as a mask where I can bring it back in if I want to, or get rid of it. It's a non-destructive way of working. Not that there's much here to destroy, but it feels more exploratory to me. Again, you don't have to do this. You can sketch with line. You can do anything you want. You can also take them a lot further than I do here. Again, I sort of treated this as just, first exploratory type sketches, but you can take it even further. You could also do quick little exploration sketches like this, and then choose your favorite and maybe fully render that one. Pick your favorite 3, render all 3 of them. It's just a fun exercise. I think the primary point to this exercise is because you're forced to sort of work with these proportions, you're maybe coming up with ideas that you might not have otherwise come up with. And that's really the main point, is to just force yourself to think of something new. Give yourself sort of a new restriction or limitation that you sort of have to adhere to, and try to make it work. If a proportion might at first seem like it might not work or something, try to make it work. Even, before the stuff that is in this video, before I even got into sketching the actual characters, the silhouettes, just playing with the proportions of the squares was actually a decent exercise. I actually did spend some time fussing over it a little bit, and pushing and pulling those shapes and trying to see what might be, what might look aesthetically pleasing just with those squares. And so don't rush that step either. When you're first sort of laying out your rectangles, your squares, do play around with it and come up with a whole bunch of different ideas. Maybe veto some of the worst ones, but try to think of it as just with those 3 shapes, what are the more interesting combinations, and that I think is something that you could do for quite a long time, to just explore different proportions. And as with everything, I think the more that you do this exercise, the better you'll get at it. And I haven't done this much, so I definitely want to do this more. It's a lot of fun. Again, it's literally just shape exploration. It feels very playful to me. I mentioned this earlier, but I think there's quite a good low barrier of entry, so to speak, with an exercise like this. I'm not a character person, so the idea of doing characters intimidates me a little bit. But when you're trying to like psych yourself up to do a task like this, it's easy enough to say like, well, at first I just have to play around with some rectangles and just play around with proportions. That's easy. I can do that, no problem. So again, it's easy to get started. And then once you've got that, it's easy enough to just say, okay, I'm just going to play around with a black silhouette and see if I can fill out those shapes now. So it's sort of breaking it down into like these really easy bite-sized chunks. So yeah, if you want to play around with designing and proportions and that kind of thing, definitely give this a shot. And again, you don't necessarily see this in the video, but when I was originally playing with just the shapes of these things, the 3-color rectangles, as you're creating a lineup, do try to give them different heights, different proportions. I was trying to think of having the lineup of characters, what that might look like in mind as I was creating just the rectangular combinations. It's just trying to show some variety within that lineup, even at the simple shape phase. And of course, once these are done, if I'm not super happy with their size and proportion from one to the other, if I want one to be smaller compared to the rest, obviously you can change that after the fact as well. It helps keep you motivated and interested in just seeing this lineup of different characters, different proportions. So going back to, the painting into the mask, obviously I'm painting in black into the mask to hide the gray layer and show through to the black layer beneath. And I'm typically doing that in areas that might have higher detail. If this was like fully lit, I imagine there's a lot of like, little gears and pistons and things like that that just get hidden. I'm just throwing those all into darkness and just being sort of obscure with those, again, because I'm not looking to answer those questions right now. But that in itself becomes a bit of an exercise in proportion, because it's just pushing and pulling with, shapes and sizes of what becomes a positive shape and negative shape within the silhouette, right? What is, maybe a plastic or metal casing, like a chest casing or something like that. And then what becomes just shadow shapes, what would be potentially like smaller detail-y bits. That becomes sort of an issue of proportion as well. And like the silhouettes, have a variety of shapes and proportions to keep visual interest. You can also reuse shape language throughout the body of a design to keep the design itself unified. And to a certain extent, try to keep the design language similar from one version to another, so that they sort of feel like they all belong in the same world, hopefully. This exercise isn't necessarily about perspective, certainly. These are pretty straight shots. There's not much perspective going on, but do keep a little bit of perspective in mind when doing symmetry. I spoke a little bit earlier about breaking away from symmetry and introducing a little bit of asymmetry for a bit of visual interest. But of course, these are they're sort of humanoid. They're bilaterally symmetrical. So even if the pose is asymmetrical, I am trying to think about like where things land from left to right side of their body kind of thing. Obviously that does become, pretty important to sell the idea. For the most part, a left and right leg will be the same. You could of course introduce something different, like like one-sided shoulder armor or something. You see that in fantasy a lot. People will put armor on just one side or something to introduce some more definitive asymmetry to a design, and you can certainly do that. But if you're doing that, just be deliberate with it. So that's more or less all there is to this exercise. Just start off with the simple square shapes and push and pull those proportions. When you're playing with those original shapes, try to create variety. Even like start off with just the heights. Let's say when you're playing with the heights of each color, try to make them different from one to the other. If the heights of all three shapes are the same, it's probably going to be a boring design because it'll be sort of too uniform. So definitely try to make some shorter and some taller. And then once you have that sorted out for the height, you can sort of apply the same idea to the widths, push and pull the widths and try to make each one a little bit different so that they're not all the same. You're trying to create variety. And the nice thing about doing a lineup like this is you can do a bunch of different things. You can have, some that are maybe a little bit safer, and then some you can go really wild with, I think mine are all pretty safe actually, but you could really go wild with some of the proportions and just see if they work, you know, try to make them work. So yeah, if you haven't tried this technique before, definitely give it a shot. It's a lot of fun. It works really well, I think, especially for characters. Obviously with today's demo, you know, it's pretty simple. They get a head, a torso, and legs, but again, you can feel free to explore this idea with other subject matter, you know, look at maybe props and buildings, architecture, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think this technique would work with a lot of different things. Personally, I think that it saves a lot of time too, because by putting in a little bit of time at the beginning to figure out your proportions with just those simple shapes, again, it sort of does a lot of problem solving for you, / creates restrictions for you to follow, so that when you're sketching, at least some of the decision making is done for you. You sort of have the proportions already figured out, and then it's just filling that in. That sounds really simple, and I know I've repeated myself a fair bit, but that goes a long way for figuring out a design. So I think your decision making from there on out will be quicker and more efficient because you sort of have more of a structured game plan for your design. And again, it's less intimidating to work with proportions when they're just rectangles. That's easy enough to push and pull. You just use the transform tool and you play around with it. It's very non-committal. There's no time commitment really in figuring out the proportion step, the rectangle step. And then again, once you do have that figured out, that's actually a good chunk of the design decisions already done for you. And then you can play around with different things like shape language, that kind of thing. Just finding interesting shapes for the silhouette and then interesting shapes within that silhouette. So here, just adding a little bit of like eyes and lights to these guys as well. So there you go, a lineup of robotic characters playing with proportions. So I hope you try it out and have some fun with it. Okay, so I hope you had some fun with that. Definitely try this out. It's a lot of fun. If you want more of this fundamentals of design type content, check out Tyler Edlin's Patreon. He's also got a fundamentals of design course at CGMA, so definitely check that out. The links to both of them will be in the description below. As always, thanks to Tyler Edlin for having me on the channel. Thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments what you'd like to see next, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye.